This lesson deals with deontological ethics, which is another class of important ethical theories. I prefer to use the term ethics of duty because deontological is a kind of a cumbersome word, and it comes from a Greek root that means duty to begin with. But the theory, at least the version that we look at here, which is developed by a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant, it can seem complicated, but I think once you understand it and apply it a few times, it begins to make sense. And it does bring out, much like utilitarianism did, some important elements of the way we think about and reason about ethics. None of these theories do I think gets things totally right, and can be, an ultimate guide to action, but they at least tell us, when we think about ethics, something about what we're thinking about and how we're reasoning about ethics. So if you recall, when we talked about ethical theory previously, we talked about breaking any kind of action down into parts where we talk about the motive, why the person did what they did, the act itself, what the specific thing they did, and the consequences of the action. Now, utilitarianism, as we saw last time, focuses only on the consequences, and specifically the happiness of everyone affected by the action. Now, Kant says that consequences are not the most important thing. In fact, he doesn't think they're very important. There are other factors that determine whether something is right or wrong. It is the motive of the action and the act. And the act has to be of a certain sort. It has to be fall under a certain kind of rule. And the motive has to be a certain kind of motive. There's some kind of motives that aren't the right kind to be able to label an action morally right. Okay, so what are these things? Well, for him, the only morally correct motive is a good will. And what is that? Well, it's helpful to contrast that with what he calls self-interest. Says, well, if we do something because of self-interest, that's not necessarily a moral motive. It's not necessarily immoral, but we can't call it a moral motive. Like if I help someone, but I helped him because I want to get something out of it, we can't say that helping the person was a morally good action, even though the action itself might have been the right thing to do. Okay, that's one part. So for him, the motive, the only correct motive, is that we act out of respect for the moral law. And what that means is that we do the right thing because it is the right thing, because we are committed to doing the right thing. Okay, then the question becomes, well, what is the right thing to do? And that's where you focus on the act. And for him, the right thing to do is an act that falls under a particular kind of rule. And what is this particular kind of rule? Well, it's a rule that meets a certain test for him. Now, again, this seems more complicated than it is probably at this point, but as we work through the examples, we'll see, okay, what is he getting at here, and how does this capture something important about ethical reasoning? So as I said, the right motive is a good will, respect for the moral law, and you do it because it's the right thing to do. So, what is the right thing to do? Remember Mary and John from a previous discussion. Mary pokes John with a stick. Okay, so we see there's Mary, and then there's the action. She's poking John with the stick. Okay, so we just keep this in mind as I sort of spell things out, and we'll get into a less whimsical type of example after this. So, what Kant says, we want to determine whether an action is the right action. We want to determine if it's the right kind of action. So what he proposes is a test. Now there's more than one form of this. We only look at two here. But this is supposed to be a test to determine whether an action and the rule it falls under is a morally right or ethically right action. So what he says is that we should act only on that maxim that you can will as a universal law. Well, what does this mean? By a maxim, he means the rule that we're following whenever we do something. We don't necessarily say what the rule is, but if we had to spell out why we did what we did, we'd say we were following a particular rule. So, Mary pokes John with a stick. We could say she's following the rule that it's okay to poke people with sticks. That's the maxim she's acting under. So, for that maxim to fall under the categorical imperative in the correct way, it has to be one that we can will to be a universal law. So, whenever we perform an action like that, like poking someone with a stick, we're saying that it's okay for anybody to poke anybody with a stick. Right? We're willing it. Can we will it as a universal law? That's what Kant says. Well, if we can't, then it's not a morally right action. In fact, it's irrational in a sense. Now, for him, Kant especially, he sees being a morally good person with being a rational person. And that's one of the things for him that separates us from non-human animals is our ability to act rationally, our ability to act according to rules. So that's one version of the categorical imperative. And we're going to apply these to another example to try to make this more clear. I'm just trying to get you to understand what this even means. So the idea is that whenever we act, we're following a rule, and for it to be a right action, that rule has to be such that it could be a universal law, such that we could say, okay, everybody could follow this rule. And not that everybody would, because there's rules that people break all the time. That's, moral rules are breakable, unlike laws of nature like gravity, for example. But the idea is that could we will it as a universal law and say, well, if everybody followed this, then it would not be logically incoherent. Okay, the second form of the categorical imperative has a few more words in it, but it's perhaps a little bit easier to understand. It says, always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So the idea is that whenever we act, we should not use people, is another way to think about it, but we should treat them as rational individuals, people capable of making their own decisions. This is very important to Kant's theory, his ethics of duty, is that people have free will and we should treat them as such, people capable of being rational, capable of acting under rules. We should think of ourselves that way too. So in a sense, we should not use ourselves. Okay, and as we get to the next example, I'm going to apply these and we'll get maybe a better idea of how they work, and then you can apply them to other sorts of examples as we go along. But for him, these two versions of the categorical imperative, the first and second form, what they do is they give us a test of whether or not an action or policy is a correct action or policy. So let's look at an example here. Okay, so the first one is act only in that maxim that you can will as a universal law. Okay, the second one is this. Okay, so our example is telling a lie. Okay, so imagine someone is maybe thinking about telling a lie and is not sure whether lying is right or wrong, and so they're studying the ethics of duty and they want to apply Kant's theory to this action. So first off, they think of categorical imperative form 1 and whether or not they can will this as a universal law. So whenever you tell a lie, you're acting under the maxim, the rule, that it's okay to tell a lie. So the question is could this be a universal law that it's always okay to lie? Well, the way we think about that is that, well, if it were always okay to lie, then no one would trust anyone. And if no one trusted anyone, because people were lying all the time, then lying itself would be impossible, right? Lying depends on a certain level of trust. So you cannot will lying or telling a lie as a universal law, because to do so would lead into a logical contradiction, because on the one hand you're saying it's okay to lie, but you're also making lying impossible, at least if you will it as a universal law. So that's one way that we could say, well, telling a lie is wrong according to Kant's theory because it can't be a universal law, therefore you shouldn't lie, right? And so to refrain from lying is what you should do, and that's the moral law that you should follow. You can apply the categorical imperative form 2 also to telling a lie and ask whether or not, well, if I lie to someone, am I treating them as a rational person? Am I using them? Am I treating them as a means to some end of my own, or am I treating them as an end in themselves, as a rational being? Okay, so, well, obviously when you tell a lie, you're deceiving someone. You're intending to deceive them. You're not treating them as someone who's deserving of knowing the facts. You're not treating them with the right kind of respect. Okay, so you are violating categorical imperative form 2 by doing so, because lying is a form of using people. It's a form of not treating people with respect, not treating them as rational beings. So obviously it fails both, and any action would have to fail both for Kant and his view. If it's wrong for both reasons, and it could be wrong for one and not wrong for the other, because for him these things work in conjunction with one another. Okay, and a little later in the text, we have the section on evaluating the theory. And one of the big objections people bring up is that Kant thinks we have these absolute moral obligations that we're required to follow. And some people think, well, there's some cases where lying would be okay, or some cases where stealing would be okay, or maybe even some cases where killing an innocent person would be morally okay, to go that far. But that's one famous objection. Now, not focusing on the objections and other sort of complications of the theory, same with utilitarianism, because I want us to be more capable of trying to understand how the theory can be applied and what insights we have into ethical reasoning and ethical thinking. Okay, not that we're just playing a game here of like, oh, here's a theory, here's how it goes, and then here's the objections to it, and then which is sort of a game for philosophers and professional scholars, but not really what we're trying to do in this class, which is try to get a deeper understanding of ethics and our own views on what is ethically right and wrong and why we think that those things are ethically right and wrong. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on the ethics of duty.